When you start eating more food to fuel the growth of the muscle, you're also going to increase your digestion, increase your caloric output. You're going to have more strength gains in the gym, which is going to lead to more hypertrophy.
Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But if you're ready to level up your life and get results that truly matter in your health, business, mindset, and relationships, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to Scheer Madness, where we have unscripted, real conversations with the world's top athletes, entrepreneurs, and coaches. Discover real-world and tactical advice from the best in the business. Let's go.
Women are not little men, nor should they be treated as one. And for decades and decades, we've been taught that the menstrual cycle is something that we have to loathe, that we just have to deal with on a month-to-month basis. But our upcoming Scheer Madness guest, Dr. Stephanie Estima, is going to talk about today how we can actually eat and train for our menstrual cycle to optimize our hormones and our mood for better health, energy, and improved body composition. Dr. Stephanie Estima is an expert in metabolism and the female body composition. She is a coach and best-selling author of the Better Body book. She is a doctor of chiropractic with a special interest in functional neurology, brain health, and the specific application of the ketogenic diet and fasting for the female physiology. You guys, I am so excited to introduce Dr. Stephanie Estima. Dr. Stephanie Estima, I'm so honored to have you come on this show here today. And I know you and I were talking a little bit even before this got started, but I love all of your content that you're putting out there on social media. Not only are you a physician on the female hormone side of everything, but I love that you talk so much about female empowerment and fitness. And I know we talked a little bit on social media too about your background, even competing in bodybuilding too, which we could definitely relate a ton about. So super excited to have you on the show here today, and welcome to Scheer Madness.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I think we're going to have a great conversation today.
Yeah. So I was diving into a little bit of your content and your website, and there was something that really stuck out to me it was your website. I think it was maybe in your bio. I don't remember exactly where, but you said women are not little men and they should be taught about their unique physiology. So I want to just kind of explore really what that means here getting started, and what really made you kind of want to dive into more of women health, nutrition, and how that's really different for men.
This is a great place to start. So I think for me personally, I spent a lot of years, did my undergraduate in neuroscience and psychology, did my professional degree as a doctor of chiropractic. So always had a love of the interplay between the neuromuscular skeletal system. So all of those things combined. And we never were really taught like the differences. There was kind of like, oh, here's the menstrual cycle. And then, we have more estrogen, and, progesterone is the hormone for pregnancy, let's say. But we were never really taught about some of the nuances and responses to, treatment protocols. And in fact, when you actually dive into the literature, it's getting better now. But in my, we'll say, upbringing in science, it's really been that most of the research has been done on men. And then the protocols for women, it's just like, well, they're just kind of small men. So we'll just tighter this down to sort of match their size. And of course, we're not small men. We're not little men with just pesky, annoying hormones. We are, I like to say we're like guacamole. We're a little extra, right? It's like, I know that when I get when I go to my Mexican restaurant, I know that I'm going to pay extra for extra guac, and that's how women are. We're just a little bit extra. We have this overlay on top of circadian rhythms and infradian rhythms. We also have a monthly cycle, of course, where we see ebbs and flows of our sex hormones over the course of a month, whereas our male counterparts actually cycle through their sex hormones over the course of a day. So even when you look at just corporate culture, right? It's like get up early and go to the office before anybody shows up. And then you do your meetings. And then maybe you take a client out to lunch, and then 5 to 7 is happy hour. All of that's kind of structured around the ebbs and flows of a male cyclical, or we'll call it circadian rhythm through their hormones. I always often say men are the sun, right? They cycle just like the sun does, and women are the moon. We cycle over the course of about 29 days. And as a woman, if you're not aware that we have this, we'll call it lunar cycle, menstrual cycle, this 29 or so day cycle, and we're trying to fit into what is a very male dominated corporate world, let's say, or in career mode, or what's expected of us, we end up failing miserably all the time, right? Because we don't always feel like getting up and going. Testosterone's not always high. Estrogen's not always high. Progesterone is not always high. But when we understand some of these ebbs and flows of our cycle over the course of the month, we can start to make informed decisions about how we structure our days, those particular weeks, and what are some of the objectives that we might be looking to achieve in that particular week, depending on which week you are in the menstrual cycle. And, personally, I'll say that, I wrote about this in my book. It's called The Betty Body I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point today, but I used to feel like my own menstrual cycle was a curse. Like this was like my punishment for being a woman. Like it was always awful. The week before, or even sometimes 2 weeks before, I was moody. I couldn't sleep. I was hot. My breasts were really tender. I had intense, really painful cramping. The days, the first 2 days or so, sometimes 3 days of my bleed week, when I would start bleeding, I would always have to bring extra pants, because it was like the flow was always so heavy that like no cup, no pad, no tampon was like a match for it. So I was always changing, clothes. And when I've shared this story before, and I'll share with your audience. Like I remember in clinic for years, whenever I had a new patient and I was, let's say, sitting down with that patient and maybe going over x-rays or an MRI or whatever it was, if we were sitting together for a long time, sort of looking at data and discussing a care plan, when we would get up, let's say when the appointment was over and we were, he or she was, leaving the room, I would have to turn, as I was getting up, I would have to turn my chair away so that the patient wouldn't see that, like at a rate of like 100%, I had bled through, my pants. So I suffered with like very, very heavy, very, now in retrospect, very estrogen dominant like symptoms, which we can talk a little bit about what that is, what that looks like, but suffered like that for years. And then I was running a nutrition practice in the clinic as well. There was a program that I was running, and I started noticing that there were different outcomes between men and women. Like it was a ketogenic style diet, and men had absolutely stellar, like within 2 weeks, they were like, testosterone was up. They were sleeping like a boss. They had lost 10 pounds, 15 pounds, whatever it was. And the women, let's say if it was a husband and wife pair, it was always like, I started noticing with my husband and wife pairs who were coming in for care for that nutrition program, the woman who had been obviously in the same environment of the man, eating the same foods as her husband, would come in and be like, I don't know what the hell is wrong. Like I've lost 2 pounds and I've been doing the same thing as him. Like we're doing the same exercise, same. So like some of the environmental controls were the same, but the prognosis was different. So I started with some of my patients, who I'm so grateful and thankful to them, who let me sort of play. I was like, okay, can we just I just want you to start tracking your cycle, and I want to maybe change the way that you eat at certain times of the cycle, because I had found some things had worked very well for me. We started to see that change. And that was sort of the beginning or the birth of, let's say, my body of work, which is how we eat as women, how we eat in accordance with our menstrual cycle, how we train, like the way that we train through the cycle, I think also should be altered. And I'm sure we'll talk into that. And then stress management and emotionality will also change through the cycle as well.
I find a lot of this super empowering for women. And even after I went through like my functional medicine certification, like we dive into the menstrual cycle and kind of the mood shifts. So like right when estrogen drops, where women can be a little bit more moody because, they're missing that like feel good hormone that plays such a big role in that. But they talk about like the mood shifts, but it's always about like kind of deal with it. Kind of like what you've said, like you're
Right.
just going to get this. And then, yes, there can be hormone imbalances, like you said, where there's like estrogen dominance, or, you're low in something like progesterone, and there's things that are off that cause issues that, taking even a functional approach, we try to restore balance to. But I haven't really heard a whole lot of practitioners really dive into like, how can we really work with our cycle instead of really working against it, or just even like trying to fight through, right? So I kind
Right.
of push through. I know I've heard people be like, well, you're going to be just tired here. So like, yes, maybe modify a little bit of like your training and things like that. But I haven't heard a whole lot of people talk about like lifestyle, modifications, daily routine modifications, dietary, modifications. So I really want to unpack that a little bit more. And maybe we can start a little bit more on the lifestyle side of everything, and then get into training and nutrition. One, I'm just super interested to learn from you about a lot of this, even too, because I wasn't taught, about how to modify that, and even a lot of my own education stuff. So one, before I even dive into that, would you say a lot of this had to be like self-taught, and even stuff you didn't learn in like your normal?
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error. And then I started diving into, let's say the effects of testosterone on the motor cortex, the effects of estrogen on the motor cortex, let's say. Always coming back to the brain. Like I'm always like, okay, how does this impact the brain? And for example, in our follicular phase, which is the first 2 weeks of the cycle, and in particular week 2, we see a surge of testosterone and we also see a surge of estrogen. These are anabolic hormones. These are involved in growth. And in terms of their impact on the motor cortex, which is an area of the brain that's involved in movement, so you're going to find that this time of the month, let's say, is a great time to start a new movement pattern, or a new, if you're starting a new workout, let's say, this is a wonderful time to do that, because you're almost like firing on all cylinders. Like the motor cortex is like primed for new activity. So I started putting things together with my background in neuroscience, and I'd taken a lot of special interest, like postdoc courses in functional neurology. So I was always trying to pull it back to the brain and like brain metabolism, and then how does that change? Because the brain is, as you mentioned, like our moods. A lot of times when we learn about the menstrual cycle, or you'll hear tropes like, oh, is it that time of the month? Or like, she's so moody, but and it, rather than it being a negative thing, one of the things that I like to think about is, this is your body's way, let's say in that second half of the cycle, when you're maybe a week out from bleeding, right? The couple of days right before, where you mentioned, we see this like very acute drop in progesterone and estrogen, kind of looks like a little bit of like mini menopause, right? We can be really emotional, but I think that is actually a superpower, because the things that you're getting emotional about, okay, maybe sometimes it's just like a commercial on TV, but sometimes it's going to be like, gosh, you know what? Like my job is really like chapping my, it's like really bothering me, or my boss is really bothering me, or, my husband or my kids. And that is an opportunity for you to say, okay, what needs to be resolved in the next cycle of my life, in the next 28, 29-ish days? What conversations need to happen? What do I need? What residue do I need to clear up between me and my partner, let's say, or me and my child, me and my boss, me and my coworker, me and my mother, like whatever, right? I think that it's really, really a powerful time for introspection, and for us to be able to say, okay, all is not well in this particular vertical, and I'm really emotional about it. So I'm going to do something about it, so that next month when I'm at the same spot that I will be again now, this is not going to be as emotionally salient for me.
That's super interesting to think about, because I know I've been told too, because I get moody just like every other woman before my cycle. I can get a little bit more emotional, but it's always like, the guys who are like, oh, it must be right before your period. It must be right before you get your cycle. And, part of me is like, oh, you're right. Right. Like I am a little bit more emotional, but I love kind of that reframe of saying, hey, like these things are still bothering you, like for a reason. Like, yes, your hormones are changes. You're a little bit more sensitive to them. But it's probably more than likely, I won't say all the time, but not coming out of like thin air, right? Like there are things that are already maybe below the surface is kind of what I'm hearing from you, but it's more so shining a light on it a bit more with the hormone shift, at least what we're experiencing there.
Yeah. And I think for the men who are like, oh, it must be that time of month, like, why don't we as women empower them and say, this is actually what I need from you? Rather than rolling your eyes and being like, okay, like whatever, I'll just like stay out of here. Like, why not make the woman feel safe and nurtured and loved while she's processing some of these, sometimes very intense emotions? I mean, I'm a mother of 3 boys, so that's kind of my mission. Like, I want, like, my sons all are very well versed on the menstrual cycle and how things change over the course of the month. And that's what I would hope for any male to be able to say, okay, this woman, this person that I love is struggling. So how can I support them right now to process and hold space for her to metabolize some of these feelings, and then maybe to empower her to do something about it, rather than like, oh, okay, do I want to get you some chocolate? Like whatever the conversation is, right?
Yeah. Instead of just being like, oh, she's just moody, she's just about to get her cycle, and kind of really dismissing a lot of that, but showing up because it's real. It's so real. Because I know, and I know you know more than anybody too. At what point though, because I know like extreme estrogen dominance, right? Or progesterone deficiencies. Like a lot of these are like, this doesn't make sense, right? Like I've had the experience where I'm like, small things that maybe really shouldn't bother me, like I'm like hyper sensitive to. So for someone maybe in that place, like, yes, kind of looking at their environment and really leaning for support and taking an empowered approach, where do you kind of draw the line of like, maybe I need to kind of get some testing and get support, work with somebody like you with a lot of that, maybe like, the emotions that are really hard to process through in those moments?
Yeah. This is a great question. I think, if you're unable to participate in the activities of your life, right? If you're unable to go to work, if you're medicating, if you need to medicate in order to function, I think that's a really big clue that things may be out of whack. Very often, unfortunately, if a woman goes to, kind of this traditional allopathic route and she describes things like tender breasts and severe emotionality and her periods are like really, really heavy, she's probably going to walk out of the office with a script for birth control pill, where I would probably say, okay, so why is this happening in the first place? So the pill, I mean, this is like a whole other rabbit hole, but is not, is used for contraception, even though I'll say that the likelihood, like what happens often on the pill is that we actually kill the woman's libido. So like paradoxically, she's on the pill, but now she has no interest in sex whatsoever. But let's just pretend that doesn't happen. That's actually not getting to the root cause of what's happening, right? We're not getting to the bottom line in terms of why this happened in the first place. What we are doing is we're symptom managing. And there's nothing wrong with symptom management as long as you're also dedicated to being a bit more of a detective and saying, okay, so why did this happen in the first place? So with estrogen dominance specifically, to answer your question, I would say that some of the first places that I'll look at genes, right? So, our genes, even though they're not our destiny, we do certainly have a blueprint. We certainly have a preference for the way that we metabolize estrogen, let's say. And a lot of estrogen metabolism happens in the liver. So we have a couple of different phases of detoxification of estrogen metabolism. It happens through something called detoxification, not the cayenne pepper and lemon and honey thing that you might see online, but like it's like actual detoxification. The liver actually does that. There's sort of 3 parts to it. There's something called hydroxylation, then conjugation, and then elimination. And at each of those points, we can actually manipulate or change the way that our liver is detoxing or metabolizing, let's say, estrogen. So one of the things that I'll say for a woman, let's say, who has too much estrogen, and we've validated that by maybe a Dutch test, or we've done a blood draw at the appropriate time of the month, you can take something like a DIM supplement, diindole methane. This is going to work on phase 1 of that cycle, and it's going to actually help to reduce total estrogen, right? So if you have too much estrogen, actually, let me just clarify this, because we often just say too much estrogen, but I do want to get a little bit more nuanced and say that it's too much estrogen in the second half of the cycle, right? So what we're talking about is actually relative to progesterone. So when you do experience those premenstrual type symptoms like the angry breasts and the distorted sleep and the bloating and the constipation, that is really what we're talking about. It's too much estrogen relative to progesterone, which only shows up in the second half of the cycle. But taking like a DIM supplement, let's say, might help to reduce total estrogen so that we balance the progesterone estrogen ratio in the luteal phase of the cycle. Of course, I'm always a big fan of like food. So like green leafy vegetables are a really great source of dialdomethanes, like your Brussels sprouts and your kale and your bok choy and your, arugula and spinach and all the green leafy vegetables. They also have a lot of naturally occurring fiber, which of course is also going to help bind up excess estrogen and eliminate it through the bowel. I can't remember where I was going with this point, but specifically with estrogen, there's things that we can do to improve function in the body rather than, let's say, just covering it up with a medication like the pill. So we can add in things like the green leafy vegetables that are going to augment your detoxification.
95% of your body's serotonin is produced by the bacteria that resides in your gut. And this explains why when my gut was a wreck or when clients come to work with me at Rachel Scheer Nutrition, they don't just suffer from things like bloating, constipation, diarrhea, but they also have symptoms of anxiety, depression, and brain fog because our gut and our brain are highly interconnected. And as Hippocrates says, all disease begins and ends in the gut. And this is the exact reason why I am so passionate about taking a functional root cause-based approach for any chronic health condition, gut issues, mental health illness, autoimmune conditions, stubborn weight loss, you name it. Me and my team do a comprehensive analysis looking at all these different systems so we can test instead of just guess, and then develop a customized nutrition plan and protocol to address these root causes and balances in the body and restore function. If you want to book a free 30-minute call with anyone from my team, click the link in the show notes or visit rachelscheer.com.
I think you're speaking to like the genetic kind of piece of why, estrogen could be high, having like the mood swings, the heavy menstrual cycle and all of that comes with it, maybe that week before you get your cycle. And, birth control tends to be that quick fix of like, hey, you have a hormonal imbalance, you have acne, you have skin issues, you have, heavy periods, here's the pill. And I know I was put on birth control. I was on for, I think maybe even 10 plus years. And then I decided to come off of it when I had a lot of health issues after competing and trying to get my gut in a better place. And I just noticed like I felt more empowered, very much throughout just my life, throughout the days of everything there too. I didn't have anything like estrogen dominance, but I definitely had acne and all of that growing up. And that was kind of the main reason why I got on it. But I love that you dive into like that estrogen detoxification side and really identifying that. I'm a big fan of the Dutch test myself, and even like the genetic piece too. Like part 2 is like that methylation piece to go along with it, correct? Like with the liver detox, and that's something we actually test for quite a bit. I know it's like, yes, there's the MTFH artifacts and then the COMT, where sometimes people can be good in phase 1, but phase 2, they're really struggling to methylate. And that can also be a bit of a genetic predisposition, or, they're just not really getting a lot of, whether it's B vitamins, things like sulforaphane. I know that you speak a lot too as well. So let's speak a little bit on that, some other root causes for maybe why someone could be experiencing the symptoms that they could maybe dive into that's beyond just the standard birth control pill.
Sure. Yeah. And I have to say, like the birth, like you said, it's like a quick fix, and there's so much allure to that, right? Like if someone has acne, or, they're getting hair where they shouldn't, or, they've missed periods and they don't know why, like the allure and the simplicity and sort of confident authority with which, a patient is told like, hey, this is like this little, it's like the low dose. Like that's like my favorite. I'm using air quotes for people that are listening on audio. It's like it's like a low dose pill. The allure around not doing anything other than to remember to pop like a little pill every day is really high, because it's much more difficult, like orders of magnitude more difficult to say, okay, let me go and get genetic tests, and let me try to have like a pound of vegetables every day, and let me try to like clean up my diet. Like, it's much harder to do that. So I do want to just say, like, I get it. Like, I totally get why that's often, like, we are creatures of, like, if you show us an easier way, like, I remember, I think it was like Staples, or like, look, it's an easy button. And it was like a big red button. And you just like, if we had an easy button for our health, like, I would press it, right? Like, I wouldn't work out 5 days a week. I'd be like, where's the easy button, right? So I totally get it. But to your point around other reasons why, like you mentioned conjugation, like methylation is one of the pieces of that sort of secondary step while we're metabolizing estrogen, and other things, by the way, as well. Like, there are other, we process toxins this way. Whenever we have medications, this is how our liver will sort like alcohol. This is how our body will actually get rid of things that are not that we shouldn't keep in the body. And estrogen is one of those, like the golden rule of estrogen, if you will, is like, use it and then lose it. Like, if estrogen hangs around for too long, it will, depending on the type of estrogen, like the type of metabolite, you can continue to, let's say, stimulate cell receptors in the breast, right? So you're continuing to get like cell proliferation in the breast, which is like never a good idea, right? We always want like the breast to like get a little break from estrogen. It can shut down estrogen receptors in the bone. So over time, of course, women, particularly in late stage perimenopause and in menopause, that's something that's of great importance, because we are now going to be in sort of a lower estrogen environment, and we want to be protecting against things like osteopenia and eventually osteoporosis, right? We don't want to have those fragile bones. We want thick, dense bones. So methylation is certainly important. You mentioned the MTHFR, which is one of many genes. Like, it's kind of like the famous one because it sounds like a swear word. But there's actually a lot of different genes. There's a lot of different steps. You mentioned folate, you mentioned like the B vitamins. So we do have to make sure, let's say, when we're looking at a patient, like the genetics is actually really great here. So I'll just shout out to the DNA company, which is a company that I work with a lot. And they do such a great job at looking at your hormonal, it's a genetic testing company, but they'll look at the way that you metabolize your hormones. And they'll also look at all of the different conjugations. So they'll look at glutathionization, glucuronidation, they'll look at methylation, and then they'll look at one of the things that they do really well that I don't think other genetic companies do is they look at your SNPs, right? Like the single polymorphism, like the single nucleotide polymorphisms, but they also look at copy number variants. So this is like, if someone's like glazing over with boredom right now, like, I'm so sorry, but this is like really important. Like, I'm so like, like you and I are like, oh, this is all great. But for the listener, they're like, what the hell is she talking about? Copy number variants basically is another way of telling you how many genes you have. Sometimes you don't get a gene from, like, we each get, a pair of genes from mom and dad. And a lot of people, like, mom's not going to give you one, and maybe dad gives you one, or maybe both parents are missing. So you also will see if you even have the gene to methylate, or if you even have the gene to process some of the toxins. So genes are like a really big thing. Magnesium in most women, because we, menstruate every month and we lose blood every month, I would say, and just generally from the diet that most of us follow, usually magnesium deficient. And that's actually one of the augmenters of the COMT gene, right? So we know that COMT actually, the more magnesium you have, the faster and better that works. That's part of the methylation piece as well. So there's a lot of different, there's almost like 1,000 ways that we can like slice it up. But if you're someone who runs estrogen dominant, what I would start doing, instead of saying, oh my God, she's talking about like 4,000 tests or whatever, is just start having more greens. Like, in your diet, one of the best action items that you can do is just start having more whole foods, and in particular, vegetables. Like, I like the concept of eating the rainbow, but I do think that I'm more aligned with Kermit the Frog here. And I do think that we should be eating more greens. It's not easy being green, and you should be eating more greens, because those do really help with liver detoxification, specifically estrogen metabolism. And you're also, like, the third piece of detoxification, of course, is elimination. And in the gut, we have microbes that are specifically dedicated to metabolizing estrogen. It's called the estrobolome. So again, consuming green leafy vegetables, I know it sounds too good to be true, but they do help with the concentration of, let's say, enzymes that shouldn't be there, and then just the overall health and vitality of the microbiome, the mycobiome, and some of the other kingdoms, let's say, that we have in the gut.
Yeah. And I love that you bring up the gut, because that's a big focus of my practice. Like, gut health is my baby. And, for even our clients that we get who are maybe suffering with hormonal imbalances, like, you guys can do things like broccoli sprouts. You can do some that are, not super high in a lot of that insoluble fiber, because sometimes for people that's a little bit of a trigger while we're working on healing the gut. So eventually we want to bring those in, but for that healing period of time. But broccoli sprouts is awesome. I think I saw, and I mean,
you can grow your own, like, they're so cheap. Yeah.
I saw like 1 ounce of broccoli sprouts is equivalent to about a pound of broccoli in the amount of sulforaphane that it has, which helps exponentially with estrogen detoxification. So starting first with, the nutrition, I'd say also, you guys, like, the biggest takeaway from what Dr. Stephanie is talking about is, if you are feeling like you can't live your life and it's really inhibiting you and you're having to get on medication like birth control or even other medications. I know women who've gotten on like antidepressants and things like that as a byproduct. That's where it's super essential to really work with someone that will help you get to the root cause, not just give you a Band-Aid, not just give you an antidepressant or even birth control. I know that's a lot what got me into this field of health, was being given a bunch of those Band-Aids. So I think that's really the big takeaway, along with eating more leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, that'll help, exponentially. But while we're on the topic of nutrition, Dr. Stephanie, I want to talk a little bit about how we can eat to really help our cycle as well. Because I know you mentioned we can work with our cycle, and I've never really dove into how we should be eating differently based off of different times in our cycle. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I've done, I've created a diet, called it, the Estima Diet, like not super, not super creative, just last name diet. So the Estima Diet is basically a program that is designed for you to eat alongside or along with your menstrual cycle. And I'll talk about menopausal women as well, because my beautiful menopausal women are always like, what about me? I don't cycle anymore. So I will not forget you ladies. I'll talk to you as well. But for my women who are in their reproductive years and are still cycling or still should be cycling, one of the ways that I like to structure a diet for them is sort of in 2 phases, right? So the first phase is more of a healing phase. It's like a nutritional intervention where we're trying to improve insulin sensitivity. We're trying to increase turnover of the cells via autophagy. We're trying to probably, in some cases, lose a little bit of weight, because, even with the estrogen conversation that we were having, the more adipose tissue that you have, you're just naturally going to be more estrogen dominant anyway, because we see that the fat cells they work. We used to think that it was just like this sort of inert stuff, but it is very much an endocrine organ as well. So the more adipose tissue you have, the more estrogen dominant, the higher the likelihood that that's going to be the case. So the first phase is like a nutritional intervention of a female-centric ketogenic diet. So what's a female-centric ketogenic diet? We've already talked about it. It's very plant heavy, right? So lots of vegetables, to your point around, women with IBS or who just have like digestive trouble. It shouldn't be raw. Like that I don't want this to be painful for you, like steamed, sauteed, where we're getting rid of most of the things that are going to cause a lot of upset. Or as you mentioned, like, I think that's a beautiful suggestion, like the broccoli sprouts, which are very well tolerated across most populations. So a female-centric ketogenic diet, I usually will follow that for at least 1 cycle. So 1 menstrual cycle, let's say. So if she's 28 days, just as a number, you'll follow that for 28 days. If you're 29 days, you'll follow it for 29 days. And then from there, you'll move into phase 2 of the diet, which is sort of like the long-term piece. So there's 2 ways that you can do it. The first is to kind of change up your macros week over week. So just using 28 as an example, because it just divides easily into 7, you would follow a ketogenic diet in week 1. And then in week 2, for the reasons that we were talking about before, we see testosterone rising, we see estrogen rising. This is the week right before you ovulate. I actually like there to be I don't like to clamp down so hard on the carbohydrates this week. I do want you to ovulate. So we increase the protein, we increase the carbohydrates. So instead of we'll say like a 70-20-10 or a 60-30-10, that you might follow, like 60% fat, 30% protein, 10% carbs, or 70%, 70-20-10, 70 fat, 20 protein, 10 carbs. In week 2, you might follow something like a 40-40-20. So like 40% fat, 40% protein, 20% carbohydrates. I can also overlay that in terms of a benefit to your fitness goals as well. If you are someone who is resistance training, and I hope every woman who's listening is doing some form of resistance training 3 to 4 times a week. That should be like kind of the base of any exercise program. This week, again, this pre-ovulatory week, we see that testosterone spike. So I like to profit from that. I like to sort of take advantage that the testosterone is rising, because it's kind of the only time in the cycle where we see this little bump of T. So lifting really, really heavy. And then the more protein, of course, that you're consuming, you are going to initiate something called muscle protein synthesis, which is just what it sounds like. You're synthesizing new muscle proteins. And then the carbohydrates that are paired with that, so we've doubled your carbohydrates from the week prior, is also going to help with net muscle protein breakdown. So that's really important when we're thinking about muscle growth, which should be every woman's goal, is to put on muscle. When you have net high synthesis and then you're restricting the muscle protein breakdown, the overall differential there is going to be hypertrophy of the muscle, like the muscle's going to get bigger. So I like that 40-40-20 in week 2. After you ovulate, actually right before you ovulate, a couple of days before you ovulate, we actually see like a really big drop in estrogen, right? So it comes right back down, as you know, and it almost looks like week 1, right? So when you're bleeding, estrogen's pretty low until we have that really big sort of apical rise in week 2. So it comes back down again, and you kind of look like you did in week 1. So I usually will return to like a ketogenic style diet, so you can kind of clamp down again on the carbohydrates if you like. You can also play with fasting. This is a great week to fast as well. And then in week 4, that week before your period, again, many of you know, like you're all going to be like, yep, this is what happens. Like you're hungrier, right? You have more, you typically have more cravings. So I actually like to increase that macronutrient split again, 40-40-20. So protein, one of the things I didn't mention, is very satiating, right? It's filling. So when you're having more protein, the likelihood that you are going to kind of be, have find your face in the pantry, is going to be a little bit lower. This is in line with something called the protein leverage hypothesis, which is to say that our bodies will seek out a certain amount of protein. And if and when that is satisfied, like the cravings shut down, we're not rummaging around for more fat and more carbohydrates. And if that protein level is not satisfied, then we tend to overeat on both the fat side and the carbohydrate side. So this is a way for women, when we are particularly vulnerable to overeating, to snacking, to feel like to being slaves, let's say, to our cravings. You can sort of override that to some extent by increasing the amount of protein that you're having. The other thing I like to actually counsel women to do this week is to actually have more calories. And I know that most women are like, oh my God, did she just say that? But you're metabolically more active. Like this week, you're actually burning more calories because you have this sort of frenzied, it's like do or die in your your uterus is like, are we getting pregnant, lady, or not? Right. So there's like, we've built up this endometrial lining over the course, let's say, of the month, and it's at its thickest. Like you've thrown in like all your macros are in there, all of your minerals are in there. Like there's vitamins and everything that's sort of created this 5-star hotel, if you will, for the potential of receiving a fertilized egg. So our metabolism is actually higher. So you can afford to eat a little bit more. So usually I'll counsel people to, increase their calories, like maybe 10%, something like that. So
Okay. That was my question.
It's not a ton. Like if you're someone who's consuming, I don't know, 1600, 1800 calories. Like that's 160 or 180
Yeah.
calories. Like
It's like a slight increase, not an excuse to go eat whatever.
yeah, it's not the Ben and Jerry's
Yeah.
store. It's just like an apple and some peanut butter, you know?
Okay. So kind of summarizing this, because this is awesome information here. I think like more women need to know about. What I'm hearing is like at the beginning, right after you have your cycle, it's doing a little bit more like that ketogenic type diet where you're in that beginning phase, keeping carbohydrates low, fats higher, protein kind of moderate. And then, when you get into that second week before you ovulate, that's typically where you pick up more of those carbohydrates because testosterone's going up a little bit. That's a great time we'll talk a little bit more about the resistance training, but to hit new PRs in the gym, kind of go a little bit more heavy with the weights. And then the last 2 weeks, this is where you were saying to still or up protein right before the cycle because of a lot of those cravings, or after the cycle or during the cycle,
right before. Yeah. So it's basically a repetition. So week 1 and 2, we repeat in 3, 4. So if week 1 is keto, week 3 is keto. Week 2, high protein, week 4, high protein.
Okay. So that's awesome. So it's a little bit of like carb cycling almost,
correct.
but throughout your entire cycle. Mm-hmm. Super, super interesting. I want to try that myself. And even with a lot of my clients, because I've done like carb cycling. I do a lot of carb backloading, but it's typically like that normal 24-hour period, kind of like going off of a guide too. So I've never really thought about to cycle it throughout the month and really see how that affects mood and energy and building muscle. Would this work for someone who's having any goal, let's say building muscle or maintenance or even a calorie deficit? Because I know you said in like that second week, right? That's a good time to go a little bit more heavy and work on building muscle by upping protein, doing a little bit more heavy weight training. Would that still work for somebody who, let's say, is in a calorie deficit and trying to kind of maintain in that? Maybe they have like 50 or even like 20 pounds to lose.
So I want to say that I think that a woman should be lifting heavy all through her cycle, but it's the way that we lift heavy that changes, right? So not all cycles are the same, but when we are, let's say when we're bleeding, let's say week 1, and maybe we'll go through the weeks and that might make a little bit more sense. I think that a woman should, when, maybe the first day or 2, you're feeling a little crampy, maybe a little lethargic. So maybe you're not lifting weights. Maybe you save the leg day, for later on in the week. But I will say that lifting heavy when you're feeling up to it is going to be optimal for you. So what I often will counsel women to do is to have a medium range set. So let's say you're lifting as heavy as you can for somewhere between 8 and maybe 12 or 15 repetitions. So that means that at the end of, let's say, if you set out, okay, I'm going to do 12 reps today, I'm going to do 12 overhead presses, and then I'm going to do 12 pulls or pushes, however you've structured your workout. At rep 12, you should not be able to do another rep without breaking form. That's what that means. So it should still be heavy, but it's heavy for 12. In week 2, when we talked about testosterone rising, motor cortex is on fire, estrogen is rising, all the things, you are lifting as heavy as you can for 5 to 7 reps. So you can see already that the weight is going to go up in week 2 because you're doing about half of the repetitions, right? So you should be able to bump up the weight, the absolute number, right? And then in week 3, because it's very much a hormonal environment that mimics week 1, we come back to that like 8 to 12, 8 to 15, call it rep range. So again, if you've chosen 12 for yourself, then it's like at rep 12, I shouldn't be able to do anything else without breaking form. And then in week 4, last week, we tend to just like, it's a little bit of a harder week. So I still think that you should be lifting, but now the weights really drop in terms of weight, and then the reps go up high. So now instead of doing 8 to 12 or 5 to 7 or whatever, now we're doing like 15 to 30, 15 to 20, 15 to 30 reps. So you can see like if you're doing 30 reps of something, right, it's going to be a lighter weight. The whole kind of overarching, this is all laid out in the book. So, if you're trying to frantically take notes, you can just pick up the book and I go through all of it. There's bonuses and all of that in there. But the overarching theme here is you shouldn't get to muscle failure, but you should be getting close to it. You know what I mean? So you should be getting close to it where your muscles are like, okay, if you do one more, girl, like this is not going to end well. So that's sort of how I want women to think about it, that we're approaching muscle failure. So you've definitely fatigued the muscle enough. Like there's been enough tearing in the muscle, in the myocyte, like in that sort of unit where you need to, consume the protein and the carbohydrates afterwards to help build the muscle back up.
Yeah. Let's speak to a little bit about the muscle side. Well, before I even dive into that one, this is awesome information, and you guys definitely need to check out her book. Because this is even something that's new for me, like cycling the nutrition and cycling the training, for the cycle. I know we'll talk a little bit about menopausal women here in a minute. But just weight training in general. I have a lot of women who listen to my show and they're like just kind of getting into weight training. And there's a little bit of that like fear side of it, right?
Yeah.
Cardio junkies out there. And I know one of the biggest things that I see with women, especially as they enter into their menopausal year, is they're under muscled, and they're over fat. So then therefore they're insulin resistant. They have a ton of inflammation. And this is actually at the core in a lot of ways why they have a lot of the symptoms that they're dealing with, because muscle is just plays such a huge role. I've had Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who I think on my podcast before. And so we dove into all of the benefits of having more muscle. But what is your thoughts for women, especially who are like, we have that fear, right? Women have the fear of the gym and lifting heavy weights. I know like the fear of getting big and bulky. And I would say, you guys, I've been lifting weights for like, I'm a little person and I've been lifting as much as I can for 10 plus years, pretty much most days per week. And I'm like, this is as much as my physiology will even let me get big. And I'm like, so do you think I'm big? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, exactly. But I know that's a fear. So I'd love to speak to that fear a little bit, for especially the women, maybe who are in the years where they can build muscle, but also is it possible for women to also build a good amount of muscle even after the menopausal years too?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I too see this myth persist that if women are going to lift heavy, that they're going to turn into the Hulk, that they're going to get bulky. And I think a lot of that comes, unfortunately, from the fitness industry, right? When they're trying to sell like gadgets and gadgets, and they'll say like, you're going to look toned, and like, just so we're clear, because I'm a bit of a word nerd, tone, when we talk about tone, this is more of a nervous system comment, right? You're hypertonic, you're hypotonic, you're atonic, like you either have a reflex or you don't. It's too much, it's too little. So when we say tone, it has nothing to do with muscle. You can't tone muscle. Just like you can't build long, lean muscles, like you can't change the origin and insertion sites of the muscle, like where your bicep starts, where your bicep starts, and it's not going to get longer. So for the women who are scared of getting bulky, like I love you and I hear you, I would invite you to think about your own physiology. Like if you are the type, like certainly there are women who can get very bulky. But when we talk about the prevalence in the female population for that kind of woman, it's like under 1%. Like you would know that you put on muscle really, really easily, because you might look like you would already be very lean. You would already have a very low fat mass, because you would probably tend to be, what we haven't talked about it today, but like more androgen dominant. So someone who has more conversion of, let's say, there's a preferential pathway with testosterone and like dihydrotestosterone, like these androgen dominant women tend to be more lean. They tend to put on muscle very, very easily. So if that's not you, right? Like you would already know. So for the 99.5 of us where we don't have this problem with androgen dominance, you're going to have to work to put on muscle. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, like, I competed, like you mentioned, like I competed in figure when I was living in New York. I worked my butt off I have been lifting weights for decades, but like I was trying, like all I wanted for Christmas was one more plate on the leg press. Like I was trying to put on weight, and it was incredibly painful, incredibly difficult. So I hope that gives women some solace. Like you're going to have to really lift heavy and probably take some exogenous substances to get to the big, grotesque kind of image that you have in your head. And I think sometimes, when we look at bodybuilding competitions and we look at females, like they can look, very different than us. And then the message has been like, you don't want to look like that. You want to look like this. So buy this shake weight or buy this, like whatever garbage that they're, no shade to shake weight, but don't get that. It's a piece of, anyway. So we want to be thinking about lifting weights. Gabrielle is a good friend of mine. We share the same philosophy. Our backgrounds are very similar as well, in that, the more muscle you have, you mentioned already, like you'll be much more insulin like sensitized, because one of the beautiful things that muscle does is it can independent of insulin actually take glucose out of the bloodstream and dispose of it and use it for the muscle, right? And it phosphorylates the glucose once it kind of gets in there. So the glucose can't get back into the bloodstream. So you're able to have more carbs, ladies, the more muscle you have. And of course, it makes like all the vain things, like makes you look good in a bikini. Like I did a post on my Instagram, something like, you got to train like a beast to look like a beaut, I'm sure when women look at you, they'll be like, I just want to look just like you, like toned, and it's like, girl, you know how much I'm lifting, you might be petite, but you're also lifting a significant percentage of your body weight, kind of depending if you're doing upper or lower body or what have you. But the idea that you're going to bulk up is just not going to happen. Like you're going to have to work really hard and probably take, some type of like, exogenous testosterone or something for that to realize.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think a lot of the fear comes from, the fitness industry too, and just like different products they're wanting to sell with the terminology, tone, build lean muscle, turn your fat into muscle, or even just things like
that. That's a fun one too. Yeah.
Don't really make a whole lot of sense there. And then when I coach my clients, I'm like, this is what I'm doing. They're like, whoa, that's a lot. And I'm like, yep. And this is as big as I've gotten. Like I competed in bikini and I was still definitely on the petite side too. And I know a lot of that's my frame. And I think too, for some women, they're coming in with probably a lot of adipose tissue. And then in their mind is thinking like, okay, now build muscle, right? And what they're probably noticing too, is they're probably going straight to like not being in a proper calorie deficit and then thinking building muscles. So like, right, the size gets bigger over time. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm too bulky. And that's where we really need to, we can still focus on the muscle side, still do resistance training, do a lot of that while being in a calorie deficit. And you'll at least maintain a lot of that skeletal muscle mass, but lose a good amount of that adipose tissue. But I agree with you. And it should never not be the focus, not doing resistance training. That can be for anybody building or even trying to lose fat too, would you say?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, when you think about, oh, well, if I have this sort of layer of subcutaneous fat and then I start putting muscle under it, I'm going to start to look bigger. What we forget in that equation, while that's it's a little bit over reductionistic, because of course, what we know is as you're putting on muscle, you are going to augment your basal metabolic rate, your resting metabolic rate, your ability to use fat is going, your fat is going to relatively get smaller because your metabolism, without you doing anything other than, hitting the weights, let's say a couple times a week, is going to lift. And so my philosophy with women, and a lot of women, when they first start working with me, it can sound like a shock, but certainly for like right now, I'm in a caloric deficit because I'm just cutting right now. I have a shoot at the end of the month, and so I'm in a caloric deficit. But most of the year, I'm in a build. So I'm either at maintenance calories or I'm in a slight surplus, and because muscle needs substrate to grow. And we've been taught as women to just be as like itty bitty, teeny tiny, as small, like so small that we're going to disappear, right? So I have all these women that are like, I've been having 1,100 calories for 10 years, and it doesn't work anymore. Like now I'm 45 and I can't see, it doesn't work for me the way it worked for me when I was 35 or 25. And it's like, yeah, because your metabolism is in the pits, right? So when you start lifting weights, you're going to naturally increase your metabolic rate. When you start eating more food to fuel the growth of the muscle, you're also going to increase your digestion, increase your caloric output. You're going to have more strength gains in the gym, which is going to lead to more hypertrophy. Like my whole philosophy with food certainly like I'm okay with a caloric deficit, especially like you mentioned, you have a client who has like 20 pounds to lose, 50 pounds to lose. I've had women lose, I've worked with a morbidly obese woman who had like 100 pounds to lose. So certainly a caloric deficit, we can work with that. But it doesn't have to be as painful as like, I remember growing up and it was like, well, if you want to lose a pound a week, you have to find like a 500 calorie deficit every day. And that's really painful. Like it's really hard to eat 500 calories less. But if you're thinking about the adaptations that come from resistance training, like the augmented metabolic rate, you can actually afford to eat more over time. The women who have muscle, they eat. Like they eat muscle. They eat food because muscle is functional, active tissue. It requires substrate. It requires the glucose and the protein and all the things so it can assemble these muscle proteins that we've been discussing. So I think that, my goal personally, with the exception of like when I'm cutting for these specific little photo shoots that happen, is to see how much I can eat. It's like, how much can I actually eat? And, continue to put on muscle and continue to like, I want to, one of my stated goals, if you've ever listened to my show or read the book or whatever, like I want to be like a kick-ass 95-year-old. Like I want to get down, like when my babies have babies, I want to be able to say, no, I'll take them for the day. Like you go to work, I'll spend the day with them at the park. I want to get down on the floor and play with their little toys, be able to pick them up from the floor. All of those things require leg strength, proprioception, flexibility and mobility in the hip, ankle, knee joint. Like I want to be the favorite grandmother. Like I want to be the grandmother that my little grandchildren eventually, come running to because I'm the fun one. And in order to do that, I have to start thinking about what that means right now when I'm in my 40s, right? So that means putting on muscle now, taking advantage of me not being in menopause. But even if I was in menopause, for my menopausal ladies, you can still build a lot of muscle in menopause. We used to think like, oh, it's like there's a low estrogen environment, so it's like really hard. You can still do it because you can manipulate the mechanical stimulus, right? Like that when you're getting in the gym and you're ripping apart the muscle fibers. And then you can also have a higher protein diet. So my menopausal ladies, like we were talking about the diet and the fitness and stuff for women who are menstruating. Menopausal women actually in some ways are free. Like they, in some ways they actually do behave a little bit more like men in that they no longer have this like cyclical fertility cycle that they're trying to optimize. So they can have higher protein more often. They can lift heavy. Well, they should always be lifting heavy in my opinion, but they don't necessarily need to bump up calories in week 4 and then go keto. And then like they can sort of stay on more of a higher protein, like that 40-40-20, I find works really, really well for a lot of menopausal women. I've tried cycling with menopausal women. Some of them love it. So I'll say, you don't have a cycle anymore. So just like follow the moon, right? So when it's a full moon, when it's a new moon, waning, waxing moon. But I've had like a lot of, from the years I've been sort of running this cyclical eating and training, I've had enough menopausal women say to me that it's, worth mentioning here that they just love the 40-40-20. They're like, I just feel so awesome on that. So it's kind of a toss up. You have to play with it and see, but the benefit of being menopausal in many ways is you have like all the wisdom and experience of your life, and you don't have to, try to optimize this fertility cycle anymore because, it's not there anymore.
Yeah, I love that we dive into like the menopausal piece because I think it is that common, story that women can't build muscle post-menopausal. And I think part of that comes from too the fact that just women who've not been doing resistance training, not getting in enough protein, like you said, chronically eating 1,100 calories per day to be itty bitty, they then enter into menopause and they do have a lot of these health issues. And it's not so much due to the menopause in itself, it's due to the fact that they have spent probably the last 30, 40 years, even maybe like under eating, no resistance training. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's my hormones. And it's like, well, no, it's not the lack of hormones. It's the fact that, your body composition, you're missing muscle mass. So, I like that you speak that it's not too late, at least, but it is also so important to start, as soon as possible. So if you're listening to this today and you're like not into resistance training, the goal is like fat loss, like we need to be focused on this. Like it truly is the key to longevity, to feeling good, getting to your 90s, just like you said, Dr. Stephanie, and just like being able to do the things you want to do and also feel good in your body and not mess up your entire metabolism in a process. So I think that's crucial for all women to hear, just always going back to get in your protein, lift heavy stuff every single day. And just like you said, we'll train like a beast, look like a beauty. So
yeah, absolutely. I love that. Yeah, that's like my philosophy. And I hope, I always say, for the women, let's say if you're 55 or 60 and you're like, I've just been that cardio bunny and doing my Pilates and, those are still great. The best time to start was 10 years ago. And the second best time to start is today. Like it doesn't matter how old you are. And there's actually countless women there's a couple of women I'm thinking of in particular on Instagram. They're like 60. I think I was watching like a 65-year-old woman and she was doing chin-ups with like a chain, and she had she was doing like it was 45-pound weight sort of suspended off of her hips, and she was like just punching out chin up after chin up after chin up, and I was like, I bow down to you.
Yeah, I forget the name. I wonder if we're talking about the same woman, but she's got like short hair.
She's short, yes.
But she changed her body composition completely like way later on in life. It wasn't when she was younger, and she like then got into like weightlifting and nutrition. And I think, like you said, she was in at least late 60s, even maybe 70s, and she just crushed in it. But I was like, how badass. Like I want to be that. But she also yes, we would have loved to start earlier, but I think it's also that much more inspiring that even later on in life too, she also then got into it. And now she's crushing it in the gym with, 30-year-old, 40-year-olds in there too.
Yeah. And I think, we all have our own journey, right? Like some people are not ready to hear the resistance training message yet. Maybe you're going to be 55 when it really lands for you. Maybe you've been struggling with something that hasn't been able to be, resolved. And this is like, maybe you think, okay, I'll just try it. Like Rachel and Steph are talking about it. So I'll just see if it works. So wherever you are, however this is landing, like it doesn't matter when, it's just do something, just start it. Like, don't worry about shoulda, coulda, woulda. We as women, I think we should all the time, right? We're always shoulding. So I think we should just like get rid of that and just start.
Yeah. Well, I think everything you've talked about on this entire podcast has been incredibly valuable. I'm going to get your book myself and really dive into it a bit more.
Oh, I'll send it to you.
And for those who are like hearing this, like, even if it's the smallest takeaway is like, I need to start lifting weights, like that's a massive win there, and then it's just like that one baby step. Like I'm going to start with doing some weights, and then I'm going to like focus on protein, and it doesn't have to be this big thing. And I know some of you guys may be listening to us talking all about the estrogen detoxification and, the timing of your cycle. And it's like, that may be a good place to eventually get to, but we're not saying like, hey, maybe do that right now, immediately. If you're new to this, like just start with, lifting some weights. Just start with focusing on your protein intake. And I think for a lot of women who even just start with that, it's going to give them a lot of confidence, and it's going to give them a lot of immediate wins. It could really domino from there after. So yeah, Dr. Stephanie, this has been awesome. And I want to be very, very conscious of your time here today. I could pick your brain for forever, and I'll definitely have to get you to come back on the show at a later date. But is there anything that you would want to share with the audience who's listening that maybe we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I would just say, if you want to sort of learn a little bit more, we've talked about the book, The Betty Body. I think that would be a great place to start. I too am a podcast host, so you can jump over onto my podcast. It's called Better with Dr. Stephanie. Yeah, I think those are really good resources to start with people. I think if you start there, and then, you can follow me on Instagram too. I'm pretty active on Instagram. So Dr. first name, last name, Dr. Stephanie Estima.
Okay, we'll put all of that in the show notes. Everybody go give Dr. Stephanie Estima a follow on social media. Check out her website. Check out her book, Better Body. She puts awesome content out there. I already learned so much just researching all about her for today's podcast, and learned even more here today. So Dr. Stephanie, it's been an honor to have you on. And this has been Scheer Madness.
Thank you so much.